Russia often parades itself as a military colossus, boasting the world's second-largest army that's brimming with an arsenal that should dominate on paper. It has the second strongest air force, only behind the United States, and an inventory of tanks and artillery that no other country can match. Its naval fleet, loaded with more corvettes and submarines than anyone else, should make it a titan in conventional warfare. Yet, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine paints a drastically different picture. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority and massive firepower, Russia struggles to secure a decisive victory over a significantly smaller opponent. This glaring discrepancy between expectation and reality begs the question, just how effective are Russian weapons on the global stage? Part of the reason may come down to Russia's tactics, with another reason being that Ukraine has received substantial support from Western countries as it tries to fend off President Vladimir Putin's ambitions. But there's another reason why Russia's army isn't as strong in practice as it is on paper. Many Russian weapons are bad. So bad that they've failed to keep up with what the West is producing, leading to Russia's soldiers in Ukraine facing heavy losses. It wasn't this way in the past. At the height of the Cold War, Russia's weapons had a reputation for being robust and well-made. They may have well lacked all the bells and whistles associated with American weapons, but they did what they needed to do on the battlefield. They worked. Take the T-34 tank as an example. Introduced in 1940, the T-34 went on to become Russia's most successful tank. It was also a masterclass in innovation, becoming the first modern tank to feature sloped armor, which makes it harder for anti-tank weapons to penetrate the vehicle's shell, and featuring an independent suspension system that made it more maneuverable. That innovation in design, coupled with a focus on functionality, would be a hallmark of Russian weaponry for years to come. The country built nuclear submarines, fighter jets, and could compete with the best the United States had to offer, and perhaps most famously, the AK-47 Kalashnikov. Often considered one of the world's most reliable rifles, the AK-47 and its variants have sold 100 million units, and according to military.com, is still the standard infantry weapon for 106 countries. Those kind of sales don't happen for a poor weapon. They're also indicative of Russian military exports in the past. Through the 1980s, Russia was one of the world's leading weapons exporters, only trailing the United States in terms of pure volume sold. Visual Capitalist provides interesting data here, demonstrating that Russia's weapons exports hovered around the $40 billion per year mark throughout much of the 1980s, before falling to the $30 billion point in 1990 and never recovering. Again, those kinds of sales don't happen unless the buyers are happy with the product, and a happy buyer, in military terms, should indicate that a country is producing good weapons, or in Russia's case, was producing good weapons. The fact is that Russian weapon sales have been declining steadily for years. We saw a hint of this in the 2010s, with Visual Capitalist showing that Russia's exports dropped below the $20 billion mark between 2000 and 2004, less than half of the sales being achieved during the 1980s. A recovery in the years that followed pushed Russia's exports back up to the $30 billion mark. But in more recent years, Russia's weapon exports have declined dramatically. Of course, some could argue that this is only logical. Russia is engaged in a long conflict with Ukraine, so it's only natural that the country will be stockpiling weapons to send to its troops rather than selling them to other countries. And that would make sense were it not for the fact that the decline began long before Putin invaded Ukraine. According to GIS, a geopolitical analysis and forecasting company, Russia's share of the global arms market dropped from 22% between 2013 and 17 down to 16% between 2018 and 22. You'll note these are the 4 years leading up to the Ukraine war, showing that the world's opinions on Russian weapons were declining well before the conflict began. The loss of so many sales to India has been the lowlight of this period of decline for Russia's arms industry. Between 2018 and 22, sales to India dropped by 37%. This mirrors the level of sales to 7 more of Russia's 10 largest customers, which collectively dropped by an average of 59%. Only China and Egypt were buying more weapons from Russia between 2018 and 22 than they were between 2013 and 17. This leads us to an obvious question: why the decline? An April 2024 article in Politico theorizes that the Ukraine war has exposed Russia's weapons for what they really are, revealing its military and weapons-making competence to be a myth. Simply put, those weapons don't live up to the reputation they had during the Soviet era. It also points to India as its main example of the global attitude toward modern Russian weaponry. The country spent $60 billion on Russian weapons over the last 20 years, but the figure is declining dramatically. Between 2009 and 2013, Russia accounted for 76% of India's weapon imports. Between 2018 and 2023, that figure was halved. Russia only accounted for 36% of the weapons India bought. The reason? Russia's weapons are old and failing. That's according to a dossier compiled by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, which examined Russian weapons recovered from the battlefield to reveal that most are unreliable at best and utterly fail to meet modern standards at worst. The dossier claims that Russia's helicopters and armored vehicles are so weak that many are unable to withstand small arms fire. Plus, its missiles are inaccurate. Ukraine claims they only have a 33% chance of hitting their targets. In an August 2022 statement, a global affairs analyst named Emisakourou Donatus honed in on the Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopter as an example. Often lauded as Russia's most modern helicopter, the Ka-52 is supposed to be equivalent to a flying tank that has a cabin capable of shrugging off direct hits from 12.7mm caliber bullets with no problems. The reality is much different, as Donatus explains. However, as it turns out in practice, the Ka-52 can be disabled with a 7.62mm machine gun. That's a far cry from a flying tank, showing that Russia's weapons often don't live up to the claims the country makes about them. Perhaps that's why so many countries are looking elsewhere to source their weapons. They can see through Russia's smokescreen, especially once they have these failing weapons in their hands. The Ka-52 is just one example. Let's move on to a more in-depth examination of some of Russia's weapons, starting with a piece of equipment that's meant to be a jewel in the country's crown, the T-90 tank. Created during the late Soviet era, the T-90 was a massive upgrade over the older T-72 and T-80 tanks in Russia's arsenal. And for the time at least, it was among the best tanks in the world. Featuring reactive and advanced composite armor, along with a 125mm gun and a fire control system that was as modern as they came, it looked every inch the modern tank, on paper. But long before the Ukraine war, it was already starting to be exposed. Russia's conflicts in Chechnya and Syria revealed that the T-90 was susceptible to most modern anti-tank systems. Once drones became more prominent on the battlefield, it was proven to be even more vulnerable. According to the National Interest, the Chechen and Syrian fighters who came up against it say that you don't even necessarily need a modern form of attack to take out a T-90. A standard rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, will do the job more often than not. The Ukraine war has exposed the T-90 even further. Not only does it have to face the RPG fire that the Chechens and the Syrians used to destroy several of the tanks, but it also has to contend with modern anti-tank systems like the Javelin. Striking from above, the Javelin is capable of easily penetrating a T-90's armor, leaving it a destroyed shell. Ukraine had received 7,000 Javelins from the United States by April 2022, and it's used them to wreak havoc on Russia's tanks ever since. Russia hasn't been able to respond effectively to this type of anti-tank weaponry. In October 2023, Forbes reported that Russia had lost over 2,100 tanks in Ukraine up to that point, with the T-90 accounting for about 60 of those losses. That in itself is revealing. If the T-90 is supposed to be Russia's best tank, why has it sent so few into Ukraine compared to its other, much older tanks? The situation has gotten so bad, according to Forbes, that Russia has been forced to reactivate T-72s, T-62s, and even T-54s and T-55s. Some of those tanks are around 70 years old. And it gets worse. So desperate is Russia to defend its tanks against modern anti-tank weapons that it started relying on what the media mockingly calls cope cages. Vice reports that these cages, which appear to be hastily built using everyday materials before being haphazardly placed over the tank's turret, were first seen in November 2021, when Russian tanks started rolling into Crimea. Lacking any uniformity in their design, the cages appeared to be a desperate attempt to defend against weapons like the Javelin. The concept is simple enough. A javelin that would otherwise hit a tank hits the cage, with the explosion that follows failing to penetrate the tank. The cope cages haven't worked. If they did, Russia wouldn't have lost well over 2,000 tanks in Ukraine. The entire situation points to Russia having failed to update its tanks so they're capable of dealing with modern anti-tank weapons. In the case of the T-90, it's not necessarily a bad tank. Certainly not in the context of the Ukraine war, as Ukraine has been forced to rely on T-62 and T-72 models. According to a Ukrainian lieutenant named Oleksandr Romanchuk, it takes 2 or 3 of those older tanks to stand a chance against the T-90. Rather, it seems like the T-90 is a relic of a form of war that's increasingly not being fought anymore. It may still come out on top when stacked against many other tanks, especially those designed before it, but it's a crowning jewel from the Soviet era that's being repeatedly shattered by anti-tank weapons against which it was never designed to have a proper defense. Let's switch focus to Russia's missiles. Earlier you heard Emissakarou Donatis's claims that Russia's missiles aren't particularly accurate. He dug deeper into this claim back in 2022, claiming that expert evaluations of Russian missiles in Ukrainian territory found that the 3M-14 caliber cruise missile, which was launched from the sea, had just a 33% chance of hitting its target. Worse yet, around 30% of these missiles hit civilian targets, rather than the military targets at which they're aimed. A March 2022 report published in Reuters seems to back those claims up. It quoted 2 US officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, and their claims that Russia's missiles were suffering failure rates of up to 60% during the first 2 months of the war. Reuters speculated that these failure rates could be why Russia failed to establish early aerial control, despite having a much larger military. Furthermore, it's why Russia struggled to capture targets quickly in the days before Ukraine was receiving regular support from the West. For context, the US estimated that Russia fired 1,100 missiles into Ukraine up to March 25, 2022. If the 60% failure rate is accurate, that means 660 of those missiles either failed to hit their targets or didn't detonate when they did. According to the military experts Reuters spoke to, a failure rate of 20% would be considered high. A rate of 60% is catastrophic. Defense News speculates that, much as we've seen with Russian tanks, the country's missiles have failed to keep pace with modern developments. In May 2023, it noted that Russian missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure were becoming less frequent. That was after a year of the country growing increasingly reliant on missile strikes, which was less a sign that the strikes were working and more a sign that Russia wasn't achieving its objectives. The outlet claims that a typical missile-heavy strategy would see an early bombardment, as we saw during the first months of the war, that would slow down once the missiles had done their job of destroying vital infrastructure and military locations. That's not what happened. A combination of poor Russian intelligence and a lack of modern targeting capabilities, Defense News says, is responsible for this. Simply put, Russian missiles are too easy for Ukraine to shoot down, assuming they even reach their targets in the first place. Perhaps that's why Russia is increasingly relying on older weapons such as its glide bombs to wreak havoc on Ukraine. The country has been taken to converting old 1.5-ton Fab 1500 and 3.4-ton Fab 3000 bombs by attaching wings to them. The bombs are launched from behind the front lines, with the wings allowing them to glide somewhere close to their targets. They're not particularly accurate, at least compared to the modern accuracy such a modern missile should have. But even if they don't hit their target exactly, they produce such a large explosion that they still cause massive damage. While you could say the use of these old bombs represents a stroke of ingenuity by the Russians, it's also an unintentional confession. Our missiles aren't doing the job, so we've had to come up with other ways to attack Ukraine. So Russia's tanks and missiles are clearly showing their age and are failing at rates nobody expected before the war in Ukraine began, but it gets worse for Russia. Its air force is struggling just as much as its ground troops. In February 2024, the BBC reported that Ukraine has shot down a staggering 342 Russian planes, along with 325 of its helicopters. That's an embarrassing figure for a country that's supposed to have the second strongest air force in the world. And again, Emissakarou Donatis highlighted one of the reasons why this might be happening when speaking about the Ka-52 earlier. Russia's flying tank can be taken down with fairly standard munitions, and it doesn't stop there. According to an October 2023 article on Breaking Defense, the Russian Aerospace Forces, or VKS, are struggling with availability rates after losing so many of its aircraft. But even more worrying for the VKS is that many of the planes it's losing aren't its older, Soviet-era Sukhoi and MiG fighters. The more modern Sukhoi models are just as prone to being shot down as the outdated jets it's sending into Ukraine. Breaking Defense goes on to report the accumulation of flight hours in many of Russia's older planes, such as the Su-34, were already in excess of the country's pre-war projections. Those craft are being forced to log more hours in the sky than they were designed to manage, essentially meaning they're running on fumes from a mechanical perspective. That increase in hours also creates a need for more maintenance, with the UK's Ministry of Defence pointing out that this is a problem for the VKS too. This need for extra maintenance is complicated by a shortage of spare parts because of increasing demand and international sanctions. An August 2023 report by RAND offers more details. It says that Russia finds itself in a position where it's still trying to transition away from the Soviet-era aircraft that made it such a powerful aerial force during the Cold War era. It's also struggling to bring new aircraft online. Around half of Russia's fleet is made up of upgraded Soviet-era planes because it isn't able to build new aerial assets quickly enough. So we see the same situation that we saw with Russia's tanks. The country is relying on technology from a bygone military era, which could explain why the VKS has been so unsuccessful in Ukraine. As for flight hours, the Soviet-era platforms Russia is using so extensively in the war are generally designed to fly for between 2,000 and 3,500 hours. That's far below the 3,500 to 4,500 hours most modern military aircraft can manage. And even with upgrading efforts potentially extending lifespans, RAND says that many of the planes Russia is losing are already deep within the last 1,000 hours of their service lives. By the summer of 2024, the organization says the VKS will be down to 75% of its pre-war strength due to combat losses and many of its aircraft's airframes simply aging out. Even more worryingly for Russia, the story doesn't seem to get much better for its newer planes. Take the Su-57 as an example. A stealth fighter that's supposed to be among the best fifth-generation fighters in the world today, the Su-57 basically hasn't been used in Ukraine. Part of that is down to Russia simply not having many of the aircraft. It only had 10 available to the VKS at the beginning of 2023. But even then, 10 Su-57s should have been able to wreak havoc on Ukraine. Russia claims the jet is one of the best of its kind, as well as being the first Russian jet to feature stealth technology. It should be featured in the war, but it isn't. And the reason may lie in the array of technical issues the jet had faced during its development. On paper, the Su-57 is supposed to be a combination of attack aircraft and fighter jet, capable of destroying targets on land, at sea, or in the air. Its body is made using composite materials including fiberglass, polymers, and a special aluminium used to create load-bearing honeycomb filters. It can also carry up to 4 K-77M missiles, each radar-guided and being launchable from beyond visual range. A combination of twin engines cooled by Izdalai 117 or AL-41F1 turbofans and 3D thrust vectors should give it immense maneuverability while still allowing it to reach Mach 2 without engaging afterburners. However, the reality is much different. Production problems mean that the Su-57, which was first flown in January 2010, didn't enter service until December 2020, a full 10 years after it first took to the skies. And when it did, several aviation experts noted that it's far from the stealth fighter Russia claims it to be. One of those experts, Chris Bolton, took to social media to point out that the jet has a radar cross-section similar to the FA-18 Super Hornet. That's notable because the Super Hornet isn't a stealth fighter. The F-35 is, and the Su-57 has a radar cross-section 1,000 times bigger than America's main stealth fighter. That poor cross-section is a major problem. After all, a stealth fighter that shows up so prominently on radar isn't a stealth fighter at all. Perhaps that's why the Kremlin hasn't deployed it over the skies of Ukraine. It knows that there's a good chance that one of its 10 Su-57s will get shot down, leaving it with egg on its face, as it tries to explain why a stealth fighter it claims is veering into the 6th generation of jets was so easily taken down by a country that shouldn't be prepared for it. So we see the problem of Russia relying on old Soviet-era tech again in the war against Ukraine. Only the Su-57 adds another issue. Even Russia's newest technology appears to be incapable of operating at the expected capacity. Hence, Russia doesn't dominate the skies over Ukraine. But what about the seas? In pure numbers, Russia has the world's largest navy, with nearly 750 assets. It should have been able to bring that navy to bear against Ukraine via the Black Sea, with its dreaded Black Sea Fleet, anticipated to help Russia claim the only waters that lead into Ukraine. But again, that didn't happen. Instead, Ukraine's navy, which is around a seventh of Russia's size, has somehow managed to decimate the Black Sea Fleet. According to The Guardian, it had destroyed a third of the fleet by March 2024, with one of its latest strikes taking out the Kostiantin-Olshansky, an amphibious landing ship that was stationed in Russian-controlled Sevastopol. In fact, all Russia's navy has managed was an amphibious incursion into Odessa during the early weeks of the war. Since then, Ukraine has managed to defend against the Black Sea Fleet by using coastal attacks to pepper Putin's surface ships with missiles and munitions. Warrior Maven points out that a problem that has already been highlighted in other Russian weapons affects its navy, an over-reliance on old Soviet technology. For instance, the Admiral Nakhimov, a Russian battlecruiser, is still armed with firepower developed during the 1980s. It has no hypersonic missiles, and despite being almost as large as an Iowa-class battlecruiser, it packs far less firepower than comparable ships. The US Naval Institute, or USNI, digs deeper. It points out that the Russian Navy underwent an extensive period of modernization, beginning in the aftermath of the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. In the 14 years since the end of that war and the beginning of the one in Ukraine, Russia should have had plenty of time to produce new surface combatants and submarines, as well as upgrade the capabilities of its existing fleet. The investment was provided, yet the Russian Navy, though growing in size, is still far behind where any would anticipate it to be. Part of the reason, according to the USNI, lies in Russia's approach to its navy. Historically, the country has always focused its ships on continental security concerns, perhaps leaving them ill-equipped to deal with something like a waterborne invasion of Ukraine. But more worrying for Russia are the periods of neglect that the Navy has been through. For instance, the collapse of the Soviet Union saw Russia reduce its navy by 75%, placing it in a position where it needed to catch up once Russia reached a point where it needed ships again. We see that in the aftermath of the war with Georgia. Russia had to invest heavily to bring its navy anywhere near being close to par. Even then, the USNI points out that Russia's modernized navy isn't much different from its Soviet-era navy. Strategy still revolves around land-based active defense, resulting in the construction of ships that are perhaps less capable of attacking positions on land. Again, the Ukraine war provides an example of this, with the USNI saying that Russia is seemingly incapable of providing direct naval support to its army's flank from the water. That's surprising, given how well Russia used that very tactic throughout World War II. It all adds up to a navy that, though impressive on paper, is far less capable than it appears. Still, where you could be justified in thinking that Russia's naval failings are as much due to strategy as weaponry, even if it's still relying on Soviet ships and tech, there's no excuse for the body armor issues the country experiences. Those issues were evident from the beginning of the war. In May 2022, Newsweek reported on a call intercepted by the security service of Ukraine that supposedly saw a Russian soldier speaking to his mother on the phone about the state of his body armor. The mother asks the soldier what he needs. The soldier's reply, "Body armor. It's just what we have now is terrible." But that's nothing compared to an October 2022 report published in Forbes. It points out that 2017 saw Russia announce that it was to receive 200,000 sets of its advanced Ratnik II body armor suits, with deliveries up to 2020 leaving it with 300,000 sets. Similar to Western body armor, the Ratnik II features aramid soft armor, which is supposed to protect against shrapnel and low-velocity bullets, as well as ceramic plate inserts to guard against rifle rounds. That armor hadn't found its way onto the Ukrainian battlefield by October 2022. Instead, Forbes claims, Russian troops were being issued body armor that was either inadequate or in some cases fake. There are reports of a replica of Russia's standard body armor designed for airsoft and paintball purposes being delivered to soldiers. That armor wasn't armor at all. It had no bullet resistance. In this case, it's possible that corruption lies at the heart of Russia's failings rather than inadequacy. For instance, 2021 saw a Russian captain get convicted for stealing and selling 56 body armor sets on Avito, Russia's equivalent to eBay, which raises the question of how many other sets have simply gone missing. Forbes also suggests that some new Russian recruits are being forced to buy their own body armor rather than it being supplied as standard. So Russia appears to have a twofold problem in this area. Not only is it issuing fake body armor to its soldiers, it appears to be running so low in its supply of real body armor that it's forcing conscripts to buy what they need. Still, if all else fails, at least Russia has its nuclear weapons, right? Putin has claimed several times since the beginning of the Ukraine war that he's considering using tactical nukes in the fight. Plus, he's made several threats to NATO and its members about the possibility of nuclear war if they get directly involved. But even Russia's nuclear threat may not be as strong as it's perceived. As Wired points out, nobody really knows if the decades-old nukes that make up much of Russia's arsenal still work anymore. After all, nuclear weapons require maintenance. The components inside them have expiration dates. They're subject to oxidation, decay, and metal fatigue. There's also the tritium problem. This essential isotope is used in hydrogen bombs and has a half-life of 12.3 years. Even if Russia has stockpiles of this isotope, which sells for $34,000 per gram, those stockpiles are subject to that same level of decay. Given what we've seen already, with Russia falling back onto so much of its old Soviet tech to make up for its modern weapons either performing poorly or not at all in Ukraine, can anybody guarantee that it's been maintaining its nuclear weapons? Or is it sitting on a decaying stockpile of nukes, many of which would deliver little more than a fizzle if they were launched? But we can only speculate. What is clear is that corruption, a focus on developing prestige weapons such as the Su-57 that don't appear to work, and a reliance on old technology are the main reasons why Russia's weapons are so bad. The Ukraine war has simply exposed how bad and perhaps serves as a practical demonstration of why so many countries that used to buy billions in Russian weapons exports are now looking elsewhere. But what do you think? Are Russia's weapons really as bad as they appear, or is the country's struggle to take Ukraine down to tactical factors? Will Russia still win the war, even if it's relying on outdated weapons? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead.